Firstly, it's good to see all of you. I want you to know that everybody on the pulpit will remember each person who was here this morning. So you get points in this coming year. As the Israelites gathered at the foot of Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, it is written that jagged blazes of lightning flashed across the sky, deafening roars of thunder echoed off the mountaintops, and a thick cloud descended and hid Mount Sinai as in a shroud. And then out of the turmoil, Vayhi kol ha-shofar holech v'chazek ma'od, the blast of the shofar blared powerfully, intensely, and called Moses and God to attention. Moshe yedaber v'Elohim ya'anenu b'kol, and then Moses spoke and God answered him, and thus we received the Torah. From that moment until today, the discordant, shrill sounds of the shofar, which we will again hear soon, shatter our complacent self-satisfaction, arouse our conscience, and even a bit of outrage at the brokenness we see in ourselves and in the world around us. The traditional 100 blasts of the ram's horn call us to attention and compel us to recalibrate our values, commitments, and vision each new year. But this year, I think, it is more essential than ever. From my rabbinic colleagues across the country, I know that these are difficult high holidays. With stark brevity, the scholar Yehuda Kurtzer recently surmised, Jewish politics are eviscerating Jewish leaders. Eviscerating, a very strong word. For rabbis have been warned, whether delicately or by innuendo, not to discuss political matters from the pulpit during these holidays. They are told anything touching on the political could cause division, dissension, and even perhaps a schism in a congregation. Sadly, this enforced silence is also pervading our family gatherings, dinners with friends, and public discussions in our institutions. We have been bludgeoned to keep a distance from discussing matters that are at the very heart of the present and future of this nation and of our world. Yet I believe that good people can disagree about issues as long as the integrity and the intelligence and the decency of those with whom you disagree is not called into question. Denigrating someone who has strong partisan views different from our own accomplishes nothing except furious anger and abiding and frigid silence and possible loss of family that will not talk to each other and friendship. Though we may passionately disagree, I believe it is essential we talk about the matters that are occupying us on each of our minds and those matters that are important in this nation. So, today I will touch on matters that should be discussed by all of us, especially because I believe that everything is Jewish. For me, it is unfeasible to disassociate Jewish values and sensibilities from our hopes for and love of this country and the society of which we are constituents. The foundational principle which I suggest that we each take to heart this year is Hillel's teaching, "Uv'makom she'ein anashim hishtadel lihiyot ish," in a place where there is lack of courage and noble character, you are mandated to be courageous and a person of strong and noble character. With that as our compass and guidepost, and with some level of shame, I confess I am guilty of not meeting that standard of courage, and I suspect I'm not alone. More often than not, we have been bystanders to the malice and extraordinary onslaught against the foundations of justice, liberty, and character which are chronicled continuously as the lead stories in our media. Reflecting on the current state of this nation, the clergy of the Washington National Cathedral, at the very center of our democracy, wrote with minor editing on my part, "We have come to accept a level of insult and abuse in a political discourse that violates each person's sacred identity as a child of God. We have come to accept as normal a steady stream of language and accusations coming from high office in the land that plays to racist elements in society. I believe my Episcopalian colleagues are correct. Our determination to fix what we witness as a broken world has eroded. We are weary of the outrageous behavior of people in the public eye and the disregard of scientific research and of the battles over and disrespect of the institutions of law. In that regard, I am not going to assign blame solely to any one side of the political spectrum. But while we feel immobilized, our young people are taken to the streets by the hundreds of thousands, demanding to halt the assault on our environment, insistent that we take guns off our streets, and caring for those incarcerated on our borders and separated from their children as an anti-illegal immigration tactic. And our young people are compelling us to combat anti-Semitism on college campuses and throughout our country because they're the ones who are increasingly the victims. Our young people care about our environment because they have already experienced firsthand the horrific effects of climate change connected by science to greenhouse gas emissions. Our children understand and properly expect that they and their grandchildren and our grandchildren have an absolute inviolable right to have pure air to breathe and water to drink and natural beauty to appreciate. We're living on a miraculous planet with ineffable scenes of exquisite beauty and majestic splendor. Let's keep it that way, so that our children's children can lie on dew-covered fields and search the incomprehensible depth and beauty of a cloudless night sky, as should be their inalienable right. The Midrash tells us that upon creation, God guided Adam and Eve around the Garden of Eden, exhorting them, "Look at the beauty of what I have created for you." And then God warns, "Shelo tikalel v'tachriv et olami." Make sure you don't ruin or destroy my world, because if you do, there's not going to be anyone to fix it. Caring for our environment is obviously a Jewish value. But not only for the environment have our children taken to the streets. Within 5 weeks after the tragedy at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, in which 17 of their schoolmates were slaughtered, their classmates and parents and others organized the March for Our Lives, in which they vowed to make sure that what happened in their community never happened again. Sadly, it did, barely 10 days later. Their movement has registered close to 1 million new voters, and the 2018 midterm elections resulted in the highest percentage of youth voter turnout ever in our history. Their stated passion is straightforward. Not one more person be killed by senseless gun violence. Not one more family wait for a call or a text that never comes. Their avowed mission is not to allow the normalization of gun violence to continue. In their words, we must create a safe and compassionate nation for all of us, to which I would hope we would say amen. We will read on Yom Kippur afternoon, Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa. Don't stand idly by while your neighbor is bleeding in the halls of their schools or in the malls in which they're shopping. That's a Jewish value. And in addition to the environment and gun control, we must also confront that in our day, diversity has become divisive. Rather than finding room for and embracing ways of thinking, diversity has become a matter of identity, and identity groups may not only dislike each other, they have become intolerant of each other. And we Jews have been caught in the crosshairs, the target of enmity both from the far left and the far right. Our children on campus are bearing the brunt of much of this. According to a new report, harassment of students who express pro-Israel ideology jumped 70% in 1 year, and some 2,500 anti-Semitic incidents in the United States have been recorded since 2015. The Associated Press reported that, capped by the deadly shooting that killed 11 worshipers at Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue, assaults in this country targeting Jews rose 13% in 2018, with more than 250 major violent cases recorded worldwide taking place in our own country. We had believed that anti-Semitism was on the wane, but the hostility that has been stoked and encouraged in our day has changed that. Whether it is because we're Jews or support Israel, we, along with others who are considered strangers or outsiders, are increasingly under attack. No less than 36 times the Torah mandates that we welcome the stranger, reminding us that we were strangers in the land of Egypt and they despised us. Welcoming the stranger is a Jewish value, just as we were provided a place of safety in this country when we needed it. Your parents, my grandparents, our great-grandparents, we need to care for others who are yearning for a place of safety in this country as well. Yes, the environment, gun control, immigration, and anti-Semitism all have political and partisan ramifications. And the result is that our silence and our inaction on these matters make us complicit in a pervasive moral and political restlessness, and I believe this nation deserves much better from us, especially because these are Jewish values as well. About this, we cannot be silent anymore and leave it only to our children as though they're the ones who have to fix what is going to affect them. We can no longer stand on the sidelines. Amos Guior, in his book, The Crime of Complicity, thoughtfully focuses on the bystanders during the Holocaust. These were the people who silently stood by and watched their neighbors and friends taken by the Gestapo and marched off to their certain death. He posits that without bystanders, perpetrators would not have been able to commit the worst crimes in human history. Now, by no stretch of the imagination do I believe we're witnessing anything that is even remotely equivalent to the Holocaust. Nevertheless, we are living through and witnessing, and by our silence are complicit in horrific family separations, increasing hostility to Jews both on college campuses and in the halls of government. We're witnessing the destruction of our environment and the incapacity of our elected officials to take even the most minute incremental steps to prevent the production and unchecked sale of firearms that, as of the first day of September, 1 month ago, resulted in more mass shootings in 2019 than there were days in the year. I know that one day, in the not-too-distant future, my children and grandchildren, and yours, will look us directly in the eyes and with unswerving determination and force demand to know, what did we do to stand up for the stranger and the refugee? Or what did we do to protect our children and their children from mass murderers in their schools or on the streets? They will indict us for not having saved them from drinking polluted water or forestalling climate change, which is already resulting in rising sea levels, horrific floods, and barely tolerable heat waves, which hundreds of scientists testify will intensify if greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise at the present rate. Our children and our grandchildren will have the right to know whether we were active in combating anti-Semitism, especially on college campuses and by elected officials. Yes, we have been slaughtered by the Crusades, the Inquisition, blood libel, massacres, pogroms, and of course the Nazis. And through every one of those horror, bystanders, for sometimes what they would say are comprehensible reasons, stood by and refrained from protecting us even in the most minimal ways. There were always the few who stood up against the forces of evil as there are today, but I don't believe enough of us are among them. The majority of us have chosen comfort over conviction, words over action, justification over justice, and as a result allow the degeneration of our principles and the erosion of our character, and along with it, the character of this country. Rabbi Jack Stern Jr., with whom I interned and adored, said this to his congregation at its service of responsibility in 1994. Through the years, we have said that the God of life keeps calling us all the time, not only at the risk-filled times of the Holocaust, but in all those other times when God's other children are lonely or sick or hungry or embattled. And again, ours, he said, is the choice to be silent and stand by, or to claim our right not to be silent and to respond the way the prophet did, "Here am I, send me." I'll tell you what gives me hope. For those of us who are old enough, we who lived through the decade from 1963 to 1973 recall the horrors of that time. In November 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. In April 1998, Martin Luther King was murdered and Senator Robert Kennedy was killed in June of that same year. There were riots, massive demonstrations, and protests throughout that decade. In August of 1965, it took 4,000 National Guardsmen to control the riots in Watts, during which 34 people were killed. The Vietnamese War ended with over 58,000 United States military casualties. In response to that war, there were massive anti-Vietnam protests at the 1968 Democratic Convention and at Columbia University in our own city, which with racial overtones, Hamilton Hall, then Low Library, were taken over, which ended only with the intervention of the police. And when on April 30th, 1970, President Nixon announced the expansion of the Vietnam War into Cambodia, student protests broke out on college campuses throughout this country, involving, by some estimates, over 1 million students. 4 days later, after Nixon's announcement, the Ohio National Guard confronted and opened fire on unarmed student protesters on the Kent State campus. 4 unarmed Kent State students were killed, 9 students wounded, 1 permanently paralyzed. And then in the early morning of June 17, 1972, the Watergate scandal unfolded, when several burglars connected to President Nixon's re-election campaign were arrested for wiretapping and stealing documents from the office of the Democratic National Committee. The Watergate scandal resulted in President Nixon's resignation in August of 1974. The decade spanning the early 60s and the early 70s, which many of us remember too well, seemed anarchical, even nihilistic, with riots and wars and protests, outrageous governmental scandal and killings, and an ambient sense that it couldn't possibly ever get worse. And yet, out of that decade, evolved radically impacting legislation and movements: the Civil Rights Act, the War on Poverty legislation, the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique was published in 1963. The National Organization for Women was founded in 1966, and the first standalone edition of Ms. Magazine was published in 1972. Within weeks of each other, in 1969, the Stonewall riots, which birthed radical social change in this country, began on June 28th. The first manned moon landing was just weeks later on June 20th, and then just weeks after that, on August 15th, the Woodstock Music Festival began. It was billed as 3 days of peace and music and was a pivotal moment in the music history and described as a defining moment in the countercultural generation. You see, if we Jews, we have been rehearsed on anything, it is that throughout our history, there have emerged from the ashes of desperation the flicker and sparks of hope and new life. We have survived the murderous villainies of the greatest evil, and yet we still believe in the durability of the human spirit and that there is in each one of us the belief that we can have radiant visions of better days. We believe that there will yet be, as there have been in the past, compassionate leaders and decent men and women who form the matrix of society and together aspire to the nobility of humankind. I don't need to tell you, we're at a pivotal time in this nation's history. Whatever your views of this nation's leadership, the character of our nation and this republic abides within and depends on you and on me and on all of us together. In a recent interview, Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that the greatest threat to our democracy is people who don't care. She called our attention to Judge Learned Hand's 1944 The Spirit of Liberty speech. In his answer to his own question, what is the spirit of liberty? He admitted, I cannot exactly define it. The spirit of liberty is in the spirit of America, which lies hidden in some form in the aspirations of us all. That is the spirit which I would hope we would all rise up. That is the spirit upon which this country built its greatness. That is the spirit which should drive us to be stalwarts in defense of the weak and the homeless and the disenfranchised, along with our own citizens. Those are the aspirations that should drive us to be guardians of the natural world upon the health of which we depend. This is a time for vigilance and voices of both the empowered and the enervated. This is the time to reach hands across aisles and across dinner tables and heal our wounded society and our broken hearts. Perhaps more than ever before, we must be part of the action, not simply to vote for or support those we would choose to lead, but to share our resources of energy and money and passion with those organizations fighting for what we believe, and we can't do it alone. And it's not only for this moment. You see, we've discovered silence is seductive. It puts us on the sidelines and makes us so completely complicit whenever we choose the sidelines over action. But the sidelines are not a place for us, not as Jews and not as Americans. So let us intentionally make a difference, now and always. This is the time for each of us, for all of us, to rise up and proclaim, Hineni, here I am, send me. We are on the brink of a new year, a new chapter. In keeping with Hillel's dictum, let us be courageous and of strong and noble character. It's up to each of us, to all of us, to breathe new energy into the spirit of liberty and justice and decency and morality, integrity and love. Especially on this day, it is time for us to listen to the sounds of the shofar that call us to awaken, reset, renew, and repair ourselves, repair this nation, help keep this creation healthy. More than at any time before, I pray we may get on with and keep at it with God's help. And in conclusion, And in that spirit, let us be uplifted by this New Year song.
Hear that? That is the sound of renewal.
Hear that? That is the sound of repair.
How does the new year call you? What gives you pride and regret?
Do you hear that? This is how we reset.
Whoa, 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 whoa. Wake up, wake me from this sleep. Oh, I'm waking up. It's time to search my deeds. Where have I stumbled? How can I redirect? My book sitting open. That's how I reset.
Hashanah Tova.